In the spring of 536 CE, the sun disappeared. Not completely, not in an instant, but over the course of weeks, a strange and thickening fog settled over Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. A fog that dimmed the sun to a pale, cold disk that gave no warmth, that cast shadows so faint they could barely be seen, that reduced the brightness of noon to something closer to twilight. The Byzantine historian Procopius, writing from Constantinople, recorded that the sun shone like the moon for the entire year, that its light was feeble and that the warmth it normally provided was absent. Cassiodorus, a Roman official serving the Ostrogothic king of Italy, wrote letters in 536 describing the darkened sun and the cold and the fear that had descended on the people around him. He described a world where the seasons had lost their meaning, where summer brought no heat, where the harvests were failing, and where the sky had a color and a quality that no one alive had seen before. Subscribe now and never miss a documentary. Every week we travel to the moments when the world changed without warning, when the ordinary was suspended and replaced by something that no one who lived through it had any framework to understand. The fog of 536 was not a local phenomenon. It was not confined to any single region, any single climate zone, any single civilization. Its reach was planetary. It was not a regional weather event, or a seasonal anomaly, or a temporary disruption that resolved within days or weeks. It persisted. For approximately 18 months, the veil over the sun remained, and the temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped by 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. A shift that sounds small but that, across entire landscapes, made the difference between a harvest and a famine. In Scandinavia, where the margin between adequate growing conditions and failure was already thin in normal years, the cold of 536 and 537 was enough to kill the crops entirely. In China, written records describe snow in summer. In Peru, ice cores show a layer of volcanic sulfate from precisely this period. In Ireland, tree rings from oaks that were alive in 536 show the narrowest annual growth rings in the past 2,000 years, evidence of a growing season so cold and so short that the trees were barely alive. Medieval historian Michael McCormick has called 536 the beginning of the worst period to be alive in the history of the world. It was the year a door opened, not a metaphorical door but something more literal, a door between the world that had existed before and a world that would be profoundly different after. What came through that door was darkness and cold and famine, and then something worse. The experience of the 536 event was not merely climatic. It was psychological, a rupture in the confidence that the world was reliable, that the sun would shine as it always had, that the seasons would follow their normal course and deliver the harvests that civilization depended on. For the people of the 6th century, the natural world was not a system to be analyzed but a presence to be lived within, and the misbehavior of that presence, the wrong color of the sun, the wrong temperature of the summer air, the wrong weight of the grain that should have ripened but did not, was experienced as something profoundly threatening not just in its practical consequences but in its implications. The world was telling them something. They did not know what. They responded with the tools available to them: prayer, sacrifice, flight, and the desperate improvisation of people who know that the normal rules have been suspended. The historical record of 536 is fragmentary in the way that almost all records from the early medieval period are fragmentary, preserved in the accidents of monastic copying, in the chronicles that happened to survive and the chronicles that did not, in the correspondence of the literate few who were both close enough to the events to observe them and remote enough from the immediate crisis to find the time and the materials to write about them. What survives is enough to establish the outline of what happened: the dimming of the sun, the cold summers, the failed harvests, the fear. What does not survive? The daily experience of ordinary people, the decisions made by farmers and merchants and administrators in the face of the unfolding catastrophe, must be inferred from the archaeology and the natural archives that the science of the past few decades has made readable. What must also be inferred is the emotional texture of those years, the specific quality of fear that the dimmed sun produced, the way that the absence of warmth in what should have been summer felt to people who had no explanation for it and no way of knowing when it would end. The cold summers of 536 and 537 were not merely uncomfortable. They were threatening in a way that went beyond the immediate discomfort, because they disrupted the cycle of seasons that was the foundation of the agricultural calendar and the organizing framework of the natural world as most people understood it. The spring that did not warm was a sign that something fundamental had gone wrong, not just with the weather but with the world. And there was no one who could tell the people of 536 that the world would eventually right itself, because no one knew whether it would. To understand what happened in 536, it is necessary to understand the world that existed immediately before it, and why that world was more vulnerable to catastrophe than it might appear on the surface. The 6th century CE was, in many respects, the most promising moment that the post-Roman world had yet experienced. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople and sometimes called the Byzantine Empire by later historians, was at the height of its ambitions under the Emperor Justinian I, who had come to the throne in 527. Justinian was one of the most energetic and intellectually formidable rulers in Roman history, a man who reformed the Roman legal code, sponsored the construction of some of the most magnificent buildings in the history of architecture, and embarked on a sustained military campaign to reconquer the western territories that the empire had lost to Germanic kingdoms in the 5th century. His general Belisarius had already achieved remarkable successes in North Africa and was in the process of retaking Italy from the Ostrogoths when 536 arrived. The empire seemed, for the first time in over a century, to be recovering its strength. The world beyond the Byzantine Empire was also, in many respects, in a period of relative stability. In East Asia, the Northern Wei dynasty had recently reunified much of northern China after a period of fragmentation. In Central America, the classic Maya civilization was at the height of its achievement, building the great cities of Tikal, Palenque, and Calakmul and producing some of the most sophisticated art and architecture in the history of the Western Hemisphere. In Mesoamerica, the great city of Teotihuacan was still one of the largest urban centers in the world. The 6th century was not a world without problems. Plague, warfare, and political instability were universal features of the period, but it was a world that was functioning, that was producing food and culture and trade and intellectual achievement, and that had no reason to expect the catastrophe that was coming. The agricultural systems that supported this world were finely tuned to the climate conditions of the period, systems that had evolved over centuries to extract maximum production from soils that were managed with increasing sophistication. A sudden cooling of the kind that 536 would bring was not merely an inconvenience to be adjusted to. It was a shock that reached directly into the foundation of every civilization, into the cycle of planting and harvest that was the basis of all complex societies. Without adequate harvests, there was no surplus. Without surplus, there was no taxation, no trade, no army, no court, no administration. The thin margins that separated the sufficient from the catastrophic in pre-industrial agriculture meant that even a modest climatic disruption, sustained over 2 or 3 successive growing seasons, could be enough to destabilize states, displace populations, and end dynasties. The Mediterranean world of the 6th century was, in some respects, particularly vulnerable to this kind of disruption. The integration of the late antique economy, the degree to which regions had specialized in producing specific crops or goods and relied on trade to supply what they did not produce locally, had created efficiencies that worked extremely well in normal times but created dependencies that were dangerous in times of systemic stress. Egypt, which produced enormous quantities of grain that were shipped to Rome and Constantinople, was a node in a supply system that kept the great cities fed. If Egyptian harvests failed, or if the ships that carried them were unavailable, or if the ports that received them were disrupted, The cities could face famine even if conditions in other regions were adequate. The complexity of the late antique economy was not a weakness in normal times. It became a weakness precisely when multiple components of the system were stressed simultaneously. The political situation of 536 added another layer of vulnerability. Justinian's reconquest wars, the campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and elsewhere, were stretching the empire's military and financial resources to their limits even before the climatic crisis arrived. The armies deployed in Italy and Africa required provisioning across long supply lines, consuming grain and treasure that, in the event of a domestic agricultural crisis, might not be available. The taxes that financed those armies came from a provincial population that, after the disruptions of the 5th century and the first decades of the 6th, was already paying at levels that left limited margin for unexpected shocks. The empire that entered 536 was, in retrospect, already running close to its operational limits, a system under stress, without the reserves that might have allowed it to absorb the catastrophe that was coming. The relationship between imperial overextension and vulnerability to natural catastrophe is one that the 536 case illustrates with particular clarity. Justinian's wars had required him to extract revenues from his subjects at rates that left limited surplus for emergency. The bureaucracy that he had built to administer the reconquered territories in North Africa and Italy was expensive to maintain and vulnerable to the loss of the experienced officials who had built their careers in its service. The military that he had assembled from the diverse peoples of the empire was effective in normal conditions, but difficult to maintain when the logistical chains that supported it were disrupted. All of these vulnerabilities were real before 536. The catastrophe of 536 did not create them. It exposed them, stripped away the margin of normality that had allowed them to be managed, and revealed how close to the edge of its operational limits the empire was actually running. The cause of the 536 event was, for most of the history of its study, unknown, and the identification of its origin is one of the most important recent achievements in the science of historical climate reconstruction. The first systematic investigation of the 536 event used ice cores, cylinders of ice drilled from the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets that preserve, in their annual layers, a record of the atmospheric chemistry of every year going back hundreds of thousands of years. The ice from 536 contains a layer of volcanic sulfate, sulfur dioxide released by an eruption and converted in the atmosphere to sulfuric acid aerosols that reflect sunlight and cool the climate. The presence of that sulfate layer in ice cores from Greenland confirmed what the historical sources had suggested. The dimming of the sun in 536 was caused by a volcanic eruption, and the aerosols injected into the stratosphere by that eruption had spread globally and reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the surface. But the question of which volcano had erupted in 536, and where, proved difficult to answer. The ice cores could confirm the existence of the eruption and provide a rough date, but they could not directly identify the source. Volcanic eruptions leave chemical signatures in their sulfate deposits that can sometimes be matched to specific volcanoes through the analysis of trace elements and isotopic ratios, but the matching is imperfect and the database of known volcanic signatures is incomplete. For many years, the source of the 536 eruption was debated, with candidates including volcanoes in Iceland, El Salvador, and the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. The most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source: tiny shards of volcanic glass embedded in ice cores from both Greenland and Antarctica. When these microscopic particles, called tephra, are extracted from the ice and analyzed under an electron microscope, their chemical composition can be matched with much greater precision to specific volcanic sources than the sulfate chemistry alone allows. In 2018, a team of researchers led by the glaciologist Michael Sigel published a study identifying tephra in the 536 ice layers that matched the chemical signature of a volcano in Iceland, specifically, a caldera system that had produced large explosive eruptions in the past. The 536 eruption was Icelandic. That identification was significant for several reasons. Iceland sits at the junction of the North Atlantic Current and the jet stream, a position that means Icelandic eruptions are particularly effective at injecting sulfur dioxide into the high-altitude winds that distribute it globally. A large Icelandic eruption would produce exactly the kind of hemispheric dimming that the historical sources describe, with the aerosol spreading rapidly from the eruption site across the northern hemisphere and eventually reaching the southern hemisphere as well. The 536 eruption was large, estimated to have been comparable to the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, which caused the famous year without a summer in 1816, and its position in Iceland made it an unusually effective climate modifier. The comparison with Tambora is instructive. The 1815 eruption of Tambora in the Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia, is the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history, and it caused global cooling of approximately 1 degree Celsius that persisted for 2 to 3 years. The summer of 1816, the year without a summer, saw snow in June in New England, crop failures across Europe, and famines in China and India. The economic disruption caused by the Tambora eruption contributed to major population movements in Europe and North America, and its cultural legacy includes the genesis of the novel Frankenstein. Mary Shelley wrote the story during the cold, dark summer of 1816, when a group of writers stranded by the weather at the Villa Diodati on Lake Geneva turned to writing ghost stories to entertain themselves. The disruption of 1816 was severe and consequential. But it was brief, affecting primarily 2 or 3 growing seasons before the climate recovered. The 536 event was comparable in initial intensity but more prolonged, sustained by the 540 and 547 eruptions that followed, and it struck a world far less equipped to absorb and manage its consequences. The physics of volcanic cooling is now well understood, and climate models can simulate the effects of historical eruptions with considerable fidelity. Sulfur dioxide injected into the stratosphere is oxidized to sulfate aerosols that reflect incoming solar radiation, reducing the energy reaching the surface. The cooling begins within weeks of the eruption, reaches its maximum within 1 to 2 years, and then gradually diminishes as the aerosols settle out of the stratosphere over a period of 2 to 3 years. A single large eruption, therefore, produces a cooling pulse lasting 2 to 4 years. When multiple large eruptions occur within a decade, as happened between 536 and 547, their cooling effects can overlap, producing a sustained climatic anomaly that lasts far longer than any individual eruption would have caused alone. This is precisely the mechanism responsible for the late antique Little Ice Age, a prolonged climatic episode produced not by a single catastrophic event but by a sequence of events, each building on the vulnerability created by its predecessors. The 18 months of dimming and cooling that followed the 536 eruption were catastrophic for agriculture across the northern hemisphere, and the human consequences of that agricultural failure rippled through the social and political structures of every civilization it touched. In Europe, the written sources from the period describe the failure of harvests across multiple successive years. The cold that descended in 536 and persisted through 537 and into 538 prevented the ripening of grain across large areas of northern and central Europe. The Germanic kingdoms that had replaced the Western Roman Empire were less administratively sophisticated than their predecessor and had fewer resources for distributing food in times of shortage. Their populations were consequently more directly vulnerable to harvest failure. The Irish chronicles record a failure of bread in 536 and 537. Anglo-Saxon and Frankish sources describe starvation and population displacement. In Scandinavia, where the Norse communities were entirely dependent on locally grown grains supplemented by fishing and herding, the cold of 536 may have been experienced as a civilizational crisis, a memory so profound that it may have contributed to the Norse mythological tradition of Fimbulwinter, the 3-year winter without summer that was said to precede the end of the world. The memory of 536 in Norse mythology is one of the most intriguing threads in the cultural history of the event. Fimbulwinter, described in the Prose Edda and other Norse texts as the catastrophic winter that precedes Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, is characterized by features that correspond closely to what the historical and scientific record shows actually happened in 536 and the years following. 3 consecutive winters without intervening summers, the failure of crops, the breakdown of social bonds, fratricidal violence, and a general unraveling of the order that normally governs the world. The specific detail of 3 successive winters without summer corresponds well to the actual climatic record, which shows cooling persisting through approximately 536 to 539. The possibility that Fimbulwinter encodes a genuine historical memory, preserved in oral tradition across centuries and eventually written down in the medieval Norse texts, is one that historians of religion and climate scientists have explored with growing interest. The Norse tradition is not the only cultural tradition that may preserve memories of the 536 event. The Mayan tradition of periodic world destructions and renewals, the belief that the current world is the 5th creation, each of the previous 4 having been destroyed by catastrophe, has been interpreted by some researchers as encoding cultural memories of major climatic or astronomical events that disrupted Mayan civilization at various points in its history. The period around 536 coincides with documented disruptions in the Maya archaeological record, and the mythological framework that organizes Maya history may preserve, in transformed and elaborated form, the collective memory of what the people of 536 experienced. The archaeological evidence for the 536 crisis in Scandinavia is particularly striking. The pattern of abandoned settlements that appears in the Swedish and Norwegian archaeological record between the late 6th century and the early 7th is not the gradual, quiet process of economic change that characterizes most archaeological transitions. It is a dramatic and relatively sudden abandonment of agricultural sites that had been continuously occupied for centuries. Sites that were maintained, at considerable labor investment, through the difficult conditions of the Nordic climate, and that were simply given up in the period of worst climatic stress. The people who abandoned those sites did not return. Some of the abandoned land was later resettled by new populations. Other areas remained sparsely inhabited for centuries. The scale of the demographic disruption implied by the pattern of site abandonment in Scandinavia is one of the most powerful pieces of archaeological evidence for the severity of the 536 event outside the written historical record. China's historical records from the same period are equally vivid. The Wei Shu, the official history of the Wei dynasty, records that in 535 and 536 there were droughts and locust swarms and failed harvests across large areas of northern China, followed by severe cold and snow at unusual times. The Yellow River reportedly froze. The official records describe populations reduced to eating bark and grass, and mass mortality from starvation in regions that had previously been productive agricultural zones. The political consequences were significant. The Northern Wei dynasty, already weakened by internal conflicts, fragmented into Eastern and Western Wei under the pressure of the economic crisis, beginning a period of political instability that would not be resolved until the Sui dynasty unified China at the end of the 6th century. The evidence from Peru adds a crucial southern hemisphere dimension to the global picture. Ice cores drilled from the Quelquea ice cap in the Peruvian Andes, one of the most precisely dated ice records in the tropics, show a layer of volcanic sulfate at exactly the 536 horizon, confirming that the aerosols from the 536 eruption reached the southern hemisphere and were deposited on high-altitude tropical ice. This finding is significant because it confirms that the 536 event was genuinely global in its atmospheric effects, not merely a northern hemisphere phenomenon. The global reach of the event is one of its most important and most underappreciated features. It was not a regional disaster but a planetary one, simultaneous and unprecedented across the inhabited world, a fact that the Peruvian ice cores confirm with a precision that the historical sources alone could not have established. The 536 eruption was terrible. But it was, as events would reveal, only the opening act. In 540, a second large volcanic eruption occurred, this one tentatively identified by ice core analysis as having originated somewhere in the tropics, possibly in the region of Central America or Southeast Asia. The timing of this second eruption, occurring before the climate had fully recovered from the 536 event, produced a compound cooling effect that was more severe than either eruption alone would have caused. The ice core record shows that the 540 eruptions aerosols arrived in the Greenland ice sheet within 2 to 3 years of the 536 layer, so close together that in less detailed ice records they appear as a single prolonged event, which is why earlier researchers sometimes described the period as a single extended climatic episode rather than a sequence of distinct eruptions. The combined effect of the 536 and 540 eruptions, what climate historians have come to call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, was the most severe volcanic winter of the past 2,000 years, perhaps of the past several thousand years. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped to levels not seen since the early medieval period, and they did not recover to pre-536 levels until approximately 640 CE, more than a century after the initial eruption. In some regions of Scandinavia, the cooling was so severe that populations appear to have abandoned their settlements entirely, moving south or to the coasts in search of better agricultural conditions. The archaeological record shows a dramatic reduction in the number of occupied sites in parts of Sweden and Norway between the late 6th century and the early 7th, corresponding to the period of worst cooling. It was in this context of compound volcanic cooling, agricultural failure, and social stress that the most devastating event of the 6th century arrived. In 541 CE, a plague broke out in the Egyptian port city of Pelusium, on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. The disease spread rapidly along the maritime trade routes of the Mediterranean world, reaching Constantinople by 542 and eventually spreading to virtually every corner of the Byzantine Empire, the Persian Empire, the Arabian Peninsula, and as far as the British Isles. The plague of Justinian, as it came to be known, was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same organism that would cause the Black Death 8 centuries later, and it killed with a speed and a ferocity that the medical knowledge of the time could neither understand nor address. By the time the first wave of the plague subsided, it had killed tens of millions of people across 3 continents. The convergence of the volcanic winter, the agricultural failures, and the plague in the period 536 to 545 produced what historians are increasingly recognizing as one of the most catastrophic sequences of events in the recorded history of the world, a perfect storm of natural disasters that, between them, dismantled the political, economic, and demographic foundations of late antique civilization and set the stage for the very different world of the early medieval period. The concept of a perfect storm, of multiple independent stressors converging on a system simultaneously, producing outcomes far worse than any single stressor would have produced alone, is one that the 536 to 545 period exemplifies with unusual clarity. The volcanic winter reduced agricultural production. The reduced agricultural production increased the nutritional stress on populations across the northern hemisphere. The nutritionally stressed populations were more susceptible to infectious disease. The plague arrived in a population that was already weakened, already displaced, already lacking the reserves of food and institutional capacity that might have allowed it to manage the epidemic more effectively. The plague killed the farmers, the administrators, the soldiers, and the tax collectors, reducing still further the agricultural output and the institutional capacity that were already struggling. Each disaster amplified the effects of the others, and the result was a cascade that no single component of the system could have produced alone. Understanding that cascade is not merely historically interesting. It is a template for thinking about the risks that complex, highly integrated systems face in the 21st century. Risks that arise not from any single catastrophic event but from the interaction of multiple stressors that, individually, the system could manage, but that collectively overwhelm its adaptive capacity. The 6th century did not know it was experiencing a complex systems failure. It experienced it as darkness and cold and hunger and death. The names and mechanisms were different. The underlying dynamic was recognizable. The comparison between these two great collapses, the Bronze Age and the Late Antique, suggests a pattern in the relationship between complex societies and extreme events that may be more general than either case alone would suggest. Complex societies are vulnerable to compound catastrophes, to the simultaneous or sequential arrival of multiple stressors that individually might be manageable but together exceed the society's adaptive capacity. The probability of such a compound catastrophe occurring is not trivially small. The Bronze Age and the Late Antique period are separated by approximately 1700 years, which would suggest a recurrence interval of that order if compound collapses were purely random events. But the recurrence may not be random. Complex societies may create their own vulnerability through overextension, reduced redundancy, and the accumulation of deferred maintenance that makes them progressively more fragile over time. The study of historical collapses is, in this sense, directly relevant to the question of how modern civilization should think about its own resilience. The plague of Justinian deserves examination in its own right, both for the scale of its mortality and for the way in which its relationship to the preceding climatic crisis illustrates the dynamics of compound catastrophe. The connection between the volcanic cooling of 536 to 540 and the outbreak of plague in 541 is not merely temporal coincidence. Researchers studying the relationship between climate and infectious disease have proposed several mechanisms by which the climatic crisis could have increased the probability and the severity of the plague. Agricultural failure displaces populations, and displaced populations, refugees moving through unfamiliar landscapes, crowding into cities in search of food, are particularly vulnerable to infectious disease, both because of their reduced nutritional status and because their movement brings them into contact with pathogens to which they have no prior immunity. The same agricultural failure that starved crops also affected the rodent populations of the eastern Mediterranean and Central Asian steppe, the natural reservoir of Yersinia pestis, in ways that may have increased the frequency of contact between infected rodents, their fleas, and human populations that were already stressed, malnourished, and displaced. The plague of Justinian killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, approximately a quarter to a half of the population of the affected regions, in the first wave alone, and it returned in recurrent episodes for the next 2 centuries. The first wave, which lasted from approximately 541 to 549, was the most lethal. Byzantine sources describe bodies stacked in the streets of Constantinople, in warehouses converted to temporary morgues, on ships that drifted crewless into harbors. Procopius, the same historian who had recorded the dimming of the sun 5 years earlier, described the plague with an immediacy that suggests personal witness. He was in Constantinople when it struck. He described the Emperor Justinian himself falling ill, though the emperor survived, and he estimated the peak mortality in Constantinople at 10,000 deaths per day, a figure that is almost certainly exaggerated but that reflects the genuine scale of the catastrophe. The military and political consequences of the plague were severe and in some respects decisive for the subsequent history of the Mediterranean world. Justinian's reconquest of Italy, which had been progressing with considerable success under Belisarius, was effectively halted by the loss of personnel and resources that the plague caused. The armies that had been winning battles against the Ostrogoths were decimated. The tax revenues that funded the military were reduced by the mortality among the tax-paying population. The administrative apparatus that organized the provisioning and deployment of the army was weakened by the death of experienced officials. Italy, which had been on the verge of reintegration into the Roman Empire when the plague struck, remained contested for decades, and the eventual Byzantine reconquest was so destructive of the remaining Roman infrastructure that the peninsula never fully recovered in the Byzantine period. The economic consequences of the plague were equally far-reaching. The late antique economy, with its extensive trading networks, its specialized production centers, its sophisticated financial instruments, depended on a population dense enough to sustain the specialization of labor and the volume of trade that made the system function. When the plague reduced that population by a quarter or more in a few years, the economic system contracted. Workshops closed for lack of workers. Trading ships found fewer goods to carry and fewer customers at their destinations. The tax revenues that had supported the imperial bureaucracy fell. The imperial government, facing reduced revenues and increased military needs, responded by debasing the currency and increasing tax rates on the survivors, measures that provided short-term relief at the cost of long-term economic damage. The contraction of the late antique economy that followed the Justinianic plague was not reversed for several centuries, and in some regions, particularly the western provinces of the former Roman Empire, it was never fully reversed at all. The cultural consequences are harder to quantify but perhaps equally significant. The great literary and philosophical tradition of late antiquity, the world of Procopius, of Cassiodorus, of Boethius, of John Philoponus, was sustained by an educated class that depended on the economic surplus of the empire for its existence. As the surplus contracted and the educated class was reduced by plague and by the economic disruption that followed it, the tradition became thinner, more fragile, more dependent on the copying and preservation activities of monasteries rather than on the active engagement of a living intellectual community. The period from approximately 550 to 750 is, in the Western Mediterranean, one of the thinnest in the literary and intellectual record of the post-Roman world, a gap whose causes are multiple but among which the catastrophes of the 6th century are prominent. The effects of the 536 catastrophe were not confined to the Mediterranean and European world. They rippled across the globe, touching civilizations that had no contact with each other, altering trajectories that would not converge for centuries. The classic Maya civilization of Central America was at the height of its achievement in the 6th century CE, having spent several centuries building the great cities of the southern lowlands and developing the most sophisticated writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas. The period around 536 to 562 coincides with what Mayanists call the Entrada, a series of military campaigns by the great city of Teotihuacan's allies against the major Maya centers, most notably the defeat of Tikal by the kingdom of Calakmul in 562. The relationship between the climatic crisis and this political transformation is not simple or direct. The Maya polities were in conflict with each other regardless of climate, but the stress that the volcanic winter imposed on Maya agricultural systems may have intensified the competition for resources and political dominance that underlies the Entrada period's conflicts. More directly relevant is the evidence from the Maya calendar and its relationship to the 536 event. The Maya long count calendar, which recorded the passage of time in an elaborate system of nested cycles, identifies the period around 536 CE as a time of renewal and catastrophe in the mythological framework that organized Maya understanding of history. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Maya books, records astronomical and calendrical information that has been interpreted by some researchers as encoding the experience of the 536 dimming event in the Maya mythological tradition, as a record of the darkening of the sun that was understood not as a natural disaster but as a cosmic event, a disruption of the normal order that required ritual response and that marked a significant transition in the mythological history of the world. In Arabia, the 6th century was a period of extraordinary transformation. The volcanic winter and the plague of the 540s weakened both the Byzantine and Persian empires, the two great powers that had dominated the region for centuries and between which the Arabian Peninsula had existed as a contested borderland. The political vacuum created by their mutual weakening, combined with the economic disruptions of the trade routes that the plague had disrupted, created conditions that some historians have identified as among the preconditions for the emergence of Islam in the early 7th century. The Prophet Muhammad was born approximately 40 years after the 536 event, in a world that had been profoundly shaped by its consequences, a world in which the established powers were weakened, the old certainties were shaken, and the conditions were, in retrospect, ripe for a new religious and political movement of world historical significance. The relationship between the 6th century catastrophe and the rise of Islam is not a simple or a direct one, and it would be a distortion to suggest that Islam was caused by the disasters of the 536 period. The intellectual, spiritual, and political factors that produced Islam are complex and deeply rooted in the specific history and culture of the Arabian Peninsula and the wider Near Eastern world. But the context of devastation and disruption that the 536 event and its aftermath created is part of the historical setting in which Islam emerged, and the speed with which the early Islamic state expanded beyond the Arabian Peninsula into the territories of the exhausted Byzantine and Persian empires cannot be fully understood without appreciating how profoundly those empires had been weakened by a century of climatic stress, plague, and continuous warfare. The world that Islam encountered when it expanded beyond Arabia was a world that had been severely stressed, whose institutions were fragile, whose populations were reduced, and whose established powers were in no position to mount the kind of resistance that they might have offered in the early 6th century. The Silk Road trade networks that connected China to the Mediterranean world through Central Asia were also disrupted and transformed by the 6th century catastrophe. The plague, moving along the same trade routes that carried silk and spices, disrupted the commerce that had sustained the cities and kingdoms of Central Asia. The depopulation of trading cities and the disruption of the administrative structures that maintained the roads and protected the caravans reduced the volume of long-distance trade for decades. The contraction of the Silk Road in the 6th and early 7th centuries contributed to the relative isolation of China from the West during this period, and to the development of alternative trade routes, including the maritime routes through the Indian Ocean, that would eventually become the dominant arteries of global commerce. The transformation of the Silk Road in the wake of the 6th century catastrophe is one of the most concrete examples of how a catastrophic event can redirect economic and cultural history. The cities that were nodes on the pre-536 Silk Road, Ctesiphon, Palmyra, Antioch, Alexandria, were all severely affected by the plague and the political disruptions of the period. Some never recovered their former prominence. Others adapted by diversifying their trade connections or developing new relationships with the emerging powers, filling the political vacuum left by the weakened empires. The resilience of individual cities within the catastrophe, and the factors that determined which survived and which did not, is one of the most interesting questions in the historical geography of the late antique period. The archaeological evidence for the 536 crisis has been accumulating over the past 3 decades, as researchers in fields ranging from dendrochronology to ice core science to underwater archaeology have assembled a picture that is both more detailed and more alarming than anything the historical sources alone suggested. The tree ring record is one of the most powerful tools available for reconstructing the climate of the 6th century, because trees add a ring of new wood each growing season, and the width of that ring reflects the conditions, temperature, precipitation, sunlight, of that particular year. A narrow ring indicates a bad year for growth. An extremely narrow ring indicates conditions that barely allowed survival. The tree ring records from sites across the Northern Hemisphere show, in the period centered on 536, some of the narrowest growth rings in the past 2,000 years. The oaks of Ireland and Germany, the pines of Scandinavia, the bristlecone pines of the American Southwest, all show the signature of 536 as a catastrophic year, and they show the recovery from that catastrophe as a gradual process that took decades rather than years. The ice core evidence has been refined to an extraordinary degree of precision in recent years. Annual layers in the Greenland ice sheet can now be dated with an accuracy of 1 year for the past 2,000 years, allowing the chemical events of each year to be placed with confidence in their exact historical context. The sulfate layers from 536 and 540 are clearly visible in those records, as are the layers from subsequent eruptions that contributed to the prolonged late antique Little Ice Age. The chemical composition of the sulfate layers, the ratios of different sulfur isotopes, the trace element concentrations, provides information about the temperature and altitude of the eruption plumes, the amount of sulfur dioxide released, and the duration of the stratospheric loading that caused the dimming. The picture that emerges is of not just two eruptions, but a sequence of at least three major events between 536 and 547, each contributing to the sustained climatic disruption of the period. The most recent and most precise analysis of the 536 ice core record was published in 2018, drawing on ice samples from a glacier in the Alps. Samples that preserve individual seasons within each annual layer, providing seasonal resolution rather than merely annual resolution for the period in question. The Alpine ice core confirmed the identification of the 536 eruption as Icelandic, provided the first high-resolution seasonal reconstruction of the aerosol loading that followed the eruption, and demonstrated that the initial dimming was essentially complete within weeks of the eruption as the aerosols spread through the stratosphere, meaning that the inhabitants of Europe and the Mediterranean would have experienced the darkening of the sun as a sudden and dramatic event rather than a gradual transition. The Alpine ice core analysis also revealed something that earlier analyses had missed: the presence of lead in the ice layers immediately before 536, reflecting the lead pollution from Roman silver smelting operations, and the sharp decline of that lead pollution in the ice layers after 536, reflecting the collapse of the Roman silver economy in the wake of the catastrophe. The ice core is, in this sense, not just a record of the volcanic event but a record of the human response to it, an environmental archive that preserves, in its chemical stratigraphy, the signature of a civilization contracting under the pressure of disaster. The lead that disappeared from the Alpine ice after 536 represented smelters that had gone cold, mines that had been abandoned, workers who had died or fled, and an economic system that had been reduced by plague and famine to a fraction of its former scale. It was pollution, and its disappearance was a tragedy. The dendrochronology of the 536 event has also been refined by the development of networks of tree ring chronologies that span multiple centuries and cover multiple regions, allowing the climatic signal of the event to be reconstructed with spatial resolution as well as temporal precision. The pattern of cooling revealed by these networks shows that the initial impact of the 536 eruption was felt most severely in the northern high latitudes, Scandinavia, Iceland, the subarctic regions of Russia, where the cooling was most extreme and the growing season was already at its shortest. In the Mediterranean and the Middle East, the cooling was less severe in absolute terms, but still sufficient to disrupt agricultural production in regions that were accustomed to a narrower range of climatic variability. The spatial pattern of the impact helps explain why the historical sources from different regions describe the 536 event with different degrees of severity, and why the archaeological signature of the crisis is most dramatic in Scandinavia and least apparent in regions farther south. The coral record adds yet another dimension. Corals grow annually and preserve in their skeletal chemistry information about ocean temperature and chemistry. Coral records from the tropical Pacific and Indian Oceans show isotopic anomalies around 536 consistent with volcanic cooling, evidence that the event's effects extended into the tropics and into the southern hemisphere in ways that the largely northern hemisphere historical sources do not fully capture. The global reach of the 536 event, confirmed by convergence of ice cores, tree rings, and corals distributed across the planet, makes it one of the best documented climate events of the pre-instrumental era. The question of how the people of the 6th century experienced and interpreted the catastrophe that began in 536 is one that the historical sources address with remarkable directness, revealing a society confronting an event that was entirely outside any living person's experience, with no framework other than religion and mythology to make sense of what was happening. Procopius of Caesarea, the Byzantine historian whose accounts of the Justinianic Wars and the Plague of 541 are among the most detailed eyewitness records of the period, was writing in an intellectual tradition that had not fundamentally changed since the classical period. He was educated in the Greek rhetorical tradition, trained to write history in the manner of Thucydides and Polybius, and committed to explaining events in terms of human agency and political causation. The dimming of the sun in 536 presented him with something that his intellectual framework could not accommodate, a natural event of global scale that affected everything and that no human decision had caused or could remedy. He recorded it as a fact, with obvious bewilderment, but he did not attempt to explain it in the terms that his historical method normally supplied. The Christian tradition offered a different framework. For Christian writers of the 6th century, the darkening of the sun was immediately interpretable as a sign, a divine communication, a warning, a punishment, or a harbinger of the end times that Christian eschatology expected. The Book of Revelation, which is rich in imagery of cosmic darkness and celestial disruption, provided specific texts that could be read as predictions of exactly the kind of event that was occurring. The sun being darkened was one of the signs of the last days, the moon turning to blood was another, the stars falling from heaven was a third. The writers who described 536 in religious terms were not being superstitious or credulous, they were applying the most sophisticated interpretive framework available to them, one that had been specifically designed to make sense of extreme events that exceeded ordinary human experience. The fact that their explanation was wrong, that the darkness was caused by volcanic aerosols rather than by divine judgment, does not diminish the intelligibility of their response. The experience of living through the 536 event was, for most of the people who experienced it, an experience of radical uncertainty, of not knowing whether the sun would ever shine fully again, whether the harvests would ever recover, whether the cold would deepen further or begin to relent. Modern people living through prolonged power outages, severe weather events, or pandemics have some analog to that experience, but even the worst such events are bounded by the knowledge that they will end, that they are explicable, and that there are institutions capable of managing the recovery. The inhabitants of 536 had none of those reassurances. The darkness was inexplicable, its duration was unknown, and the institutions that might have managed a recovery, the Roman imperial administration, the trade networks of the Mediterranean, the agricultural systems that had sustained civilization for centuries, were themselves being destroyed by the consequences of the event they were trying to manage. The psychological impact of the 536 event can be partially recovered from the written sources that survive, and what they reveal is a society under conditions of extreme existential stress, conditions that produced responses ranging from desperate pragmatism to apocalyptic terror. Cassiodorus, writing his letters from the court of the Ostrogothic king Theodahad, attempted to explain the dimmed sun in terms that were both practically useful and intellectually reassuring. He described the phenomenon as a natural event, unusual but not unprecedented, attributable to the moisture in the air, and he urged his correspondents not to panic. His tone is that of an educated man trying to hold together a worldview that the events around him are threatening to dissolve. Procopius was more straightforwardly alarmed. His description of the sun shining like the moon lacks the reassuring framework that Cassiodorus attempted to supply. And the anonymous chroniclers of Ireland and Northern Europe, working in a tradition that made no sharp distinction between natural and supernatural events, simply recorded what they saw. The sun was wrong, the harvests were failing, and the world was behaving in ways it had not behaved before. The response of religious institutions to the 536 crisis was predictably intense. Special prayers and liturgical ceremonies were instituted across the Christian world in response to the apparently divine judgment that the dimming of the sun represented. Monasteries, which had the dual advantage of communal organization and the ability to draw on reserves accumulated in better years, became focal points for the management of the food crisis in the regions where they existed. The long tradition of monastic charity, the provision of food and care to the poor, was put to its most severe test in the years of famine, and the monasteries that survived those years emerged with enhanced prestige and expanded institutional roles that they would maintain throughout the medieval period. The crisis of 536, in this sense, contributed to the growth of the monastic institution as a central feature of medieval European society, the Church becoming more prominent precisely because the state was less capable. The late antique Little Ice Age, The climatic episode that began with the 536 eruption and persisted until approximately 640 CE had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate crisis of famine and plague, reshaping the demographic, political, and cultural landscape of the Old World in ways that determined the character of the medieval period that followed. The population of the Byzantine Empire, which had perhaps reached 60 million people at its peak in the early 6th century, fell catastrophically in the period 536 to 600. The combination of famine, plague, warfare, and climatic stress reduced the population by estimates ranging from 20 to 40%, a loss comparable in magnitude to the Black Death of the 14th century, occurring in a society that had less institutional capacity to absorb and recover from such losses. The provinces that had been the agricultural heartland of the late Roman Empire, Egypt, Syria, North Africa, were all affected by both the plague and the political disruptions of the period, and their agricultural output never fully recovered to the levels of the early 6th century. The Persian Sasanian Empire, which had been the Byzantine Empire's principal rival and which had also been severely affected by the plague of Justinian, experienced a similar trajectory of demographic collapse and political instability. By the early 7th century, both empires were so weakened by the accumulated disasters of the preceding century that the Arab armies that emerged from the Arabian Peninsula in the 630s were able to conquer the Persian Empire entirely and take the richest provinces of the Byzantine Empire, Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, within a generation. The Islamic conquests of the 7th century, which historians have traditionally explained in terms of the military and religious energy of the early Muslim community, were made possible in significant part by the exhaustion of the established powers, an exhaustion that traced directly back to the cascading disasters that had begun with the darkening of the sun in 536. The Germanic kingdoms of Western Europe that had replaced the Western Roman Empire were also transformed by the period. The Justinianic plague, which reached Gaul, Spain, and Britain in the late 540s, killed proportions of the population comparable to those in the East. The Lombard invasion of Italy in 568, which ended Byzantine hopes of restoring Roman rule in the peninsula, was itself partly a consequence of the depopulation of the Italian countryside that the plague had caused. The empty landscape that the Lombards occupied had been abandoned by populations that had died of plague rather than been defeated in battle. The foundation of the medieval European order, the division between a Latin-speaking Roman Catholic West and a Greek-speaking Orthodox East, the weakness of central political authority, the dominance of the Church as the primary institution of social organization, was substantially determined by the catastrophes of the 6th century. The long-term consequences for European political development were equally profound. The weakness of central authority that resulted from the 6th century demographic collapse created conditions for the emergence of the feudal system, an adaptive response to a world where the population was too small and the institutional capacity too reduced to sustain Roman-style administration. The lords and vassals of the early medieval period developed the institutions appropriate to their radically reduced environment. And the Catholic Church's dominance of medieval intellectual life was, in significant part, a consequence of the same catastrophe. Monasteries that preserved classical learning emerged from the crisis as the primary institutions of intellectual life, their survival reflecting the institutional continuity that secular states had lost. The genetic legacy of the 6th century catastrophe is also being revealed by ancient DNA analysis. Studies of medieval European populations show genetic patterns consistent with significant population replacement in the 6th and 7th centuries, reflecting the movements of displaced populations and the expansion of new groups into territories depopulated by plague and famine. The Justinianic plague, like the Black Death 8 centuries later, left a permanent mark on the human genome, changing the distribution of immune variants in ways that are still detectable today, reflecting the brutal efficiency with which natural selection operates when epidemic disease removes a significant fraction of the population within a few years. The recovery of the climate after the late antique Little Ice Age was not linear or uniform. The full recovery of European temperatures to pre-536 levels occurred approximately around 640 CE, more than a century after the initial eruption. But the recovery of population, agricultural production, and institutional complexity took still longer. The demographic and economic levels of the early 6th century were not reached again in much of Western Europe until the 11th and 12th centuries. The shadow of 536 was long, measured not just in the decades of famine and plague that immediately followed, but in the century of reconstruction during which the medieval world was built from what the catastrophe had left behind. The case of Egypt illustrates the capacity for recovery that some regions possessed even within the catastrophe. Egypt's agricultural system, dependent on the Nile flood rather than rainfall, was less directly affected by the volcanic cooling than rain-fed agriculture in northern Europe and the Middle East. The Nile continued to flood, the fields continued to produce, and Egypt recovered agricultural productivity somewhat faster than other regions, contributing to its eventual importance as the primary grain supplier of the expanding Islamic Caliphate in the 7th century. The scientific investigation of the 536 event has become, in the past decade, a model for a new kind of historical inquiry, one that combines the methods of climate science, archaeology, history, and genetics to reconstruct the past with a precision and a comprehensiveness that no single discipline could achieve alone. The key insight driving this interdisciplinary approach is that natural archives, the ice cores, the tree rings, the sediment records, the cave stalagmites, preserve information about the past with a fidelity and a temporal resolution that the historical record often cannot match. A tree ring from 536 is not subject to the biases of the historian who recorded the events of that year, not filtered through the concerns of the patron who commissioned the chronicle, not limited to the linguistic and cultural world of the medieval scribe who copied it. It simply records what the climate was like in that particular growing season, in that particular location, with a precision that modern analytical chemistry can extract from the cellulose of the wood. When the natural archives agree with the historical record, when the narrow tree rings of 536 coincide with the chronicler's descriptions of failed harvests, when the ice core sulfate layers coincide with the written accounts of the darkened sun, the convergence of independent evidence creates a degree of confidence about the past that neither source could provide alone. The genetics of ancient populations has added another dimension to this picture. Ancient DNA extracted from the bones of people who died in the 6th century has allowed researchers to trace the movements of populations, to identify the genetic signature of the plague pathogen, and to reconstruct the demographic collapse of the period with a resolution that archaeological evidence alone cannot provide. The genome of Yersinia pestis, extracted from the dental pulp of plague victims buried in 6th century cemeteries across Europe and the Near East, confirms that the plague of Justinian was indeed caused by the same bacterium that caused the Black Death, and the phylogenetic analysis of the ancient plague genomes reveals the routes by which the disease spread, the speed at which it moved, and the relationship between the Justinianic plague and the subsequent medieval plague pandemics. The synthesis of these multiple lines of evidence has produced what is sometimes called a new historical climatology, an approach to studying the human past that treats climate not as a backdrop to events but as an active participant in them, one whose fluctuations can be quantified and whose effects can be traced through multiple lines of evidence. The 536 event has become one of the foundational case studies of this new approach, not because it is unique in the interaction between climate and history, but because the convergence of the natural archives and the historical record is unusually clear, and because the scale of the consequences is unusually large. It is, in this sense, a template, a model for understanding how extreme climatic events interact with the social, political, and epidemiological systems of the time to produce outcomes that none of the individual components could have produced alone. The field of historical climatology has also benefited from advances in the analysis of speleothems, the cave formations that grow by slow deposition of calcium carbonate and that preserve in their chemical composition a detailed record of temperature and precipitation conditions at the time of their formation. Speleothems from caves across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia have been analyzed for the period around 536, and their oxygen isotope ratios provide an independent record of the climatic changes that complements the ice core and tree ring evidence. The convergence of multiple independent proxy records, each with its own uncertainties and biases but each telling essentially the same story, is one of the strongest arguments for the reality and the magnitude of the 536 climatic event. No single proxy record, interpreted in isolation, would be sufficient to establish the picture that all of them together have assembled. The strength of the evidence comes from its convergence. The human genetic evidence has also contributed to this picture in unexpected ways. Ancient DNA studies of populations from across Europe and the Middle East have revealed patterns of population change in the 6th and 7th centuries consistent with the demographic disruptions suggested by the historical and archaeological record. The genetic diversity of European populations shows changes in the late 6th and early 7th century consistent with significant population replacement in some regions. Evidence that the plague and the social disruptions it caused did not merely reduce populations but shifted their composition, as some groups were eliminated and others expanded to fill the vacated ecological and social niches. The genetic history of the populations that survived the 6th century catastrophe is, in part, the history of that survival, the biological signature of who made it through and who did not, preserved in the DNA of their descendants. The lead pollution record preserved in alpine ice cores adds another dimension. The sharp decline in atmospheric lead, a byproduct of Roman silver smelting, that appears in ice cores after 536 is a direct measure of the economic contraction that followed the catastrophe. Smelters went cold. Mines were abandoned. Workers died or fled. The ice core is not just a climate record, it is an economic record, a historical record, a record of a civilization under extreme stress. Reading it requires the combined expertise of glaciologists, chemists, economists, and historians. But when all of those disciplines converge on the same archive, the picture that emerges is extraordinarily rich. The parallels between the 6th century catastrophe and the challenges facing the 21st century are impossible to ignore, and they have not been ignored by researchers who study both the historical event and the contemporary risks. The mechanism by which the 536 event caused its global disruption, the injection of large quantities of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it was converted to sulfuric acid aerosols that reflected sunlight and cooled the climate, is one that modern atmospheric scientists understand in considerable detail, both from the study of historical eruptions and from the analysis of more recent events like the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo, which produced a global cooling of approximately half a degree Celsius that persisted for 2 to 3 years. The cooling caused by Pinatubo was enough to produce measurable reductions in crop yields across several regions and to generate year-on-year fluctuations in global average temperature that are clearly visible in the instrumental record. The eruption that produced the 536 event was substantially larger than Pinatubo. Estimates suggest it injected 2 to 5 times as much sulfur dioxide, and it occurred in a world that was far more vulnerable to climatic disruption than the modern world, with no global food distribution networks, no fertilizers or pesticides, and no early warning systems. The risk of a future large volcanic eruption is not a matter of speculation. It is a certainty on geological timescales. The question is not whether it will happen, but when, and whether the modern world is better prepared to absorb the shock than the 6th century was. The answer is complicated. Modern agricultural systems are enormously more productive than their pre-industrial predecessors, and global trade networks allow the redistribution of food from regions that have surpluses to regions that have shortfalls in ways that were impossible in the 6th century. Modern weather forecasting and climate monitoring would allow a volcanic winter to be anticipated and its effects managed to a degree that was entirely beyond the capacity of any 6th century institution. In these respects, the modern world is dramatically better positioned to absorb the shock of a large volcanic eruption than the world of 536. But modern agricultural systems also have vulnerabilities that pre-industrial systems did not. The global food system depends on a small number of staple crops, wheat, rice, maize, soybeans, grown in concentrated regions and distributed through supply chains that are efficient in normal conditions but fragile in the face of simultaneous disruption across multiple regions. The specialization and geographic concentration of modern food production mean that a volcanic winter severe enough to disrupt harvests across multiple major agricultural regions simultaneously, as the 536 event did, would have effects on global food supplies that the redistribution systems might not be able to fully manage. The modern world is also more interconnected in other ways that could amplify rather than dampen the effects of a major volcanic event. The financial systems, energy grids, and supply chains that modern economies depend on are deeply integrated across national borders, and a severe enough disruption to any of them could cascade through the system in ways that the historical record does not provide clear precedents for. The specific scenario of a large volcanic eruption causing a modern food crisis has been analyzed by researchers at institutions ranging from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research to the Global Challenges Foundation, and the conclusions are sobering. A volcanic winter comparable to the 536 event, which reduced global average temperatures by 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius for several years, would, according to these analyses, reduce global crop yields by 15 to 30% in the first affected year, with the effects concentrated in the high-latitude regions where the cooling would be most severe. The regions most affected would include the major grain-producing areas of the Northern Hemisphere, the North American plains, the European breadbasket, the Russian and Ukrainian steppe, the Chinese agricultural heartland. The simultaneous disruption of all of these regions would exceed the capacity of global grain reserves, which are currently maintained at approximately 70 to 100 days of global consumption, to compensate. The result, if the disruption persisted for more than one growing season, would be a global food crisis of a severity without modern precedent. The nuclear winter scenario, the volcanic winter's even more severe cousin, produced by the injection of soot rather than sulfate aerosols from a large-scale nuclear exchange, would produce even more extreme cooling and even more catastrophic agricultural disruption. The research on nuclear winter, which was first systematically developed in the 1980s and has been refined with modern climate models in subsequent decades, draws directly on the understanding of volcanic winters that the study of events like 536 has provided. The mechanisms are different. Soot absorbs rather than reflects solar radiation, producing a warmer stratosphere and a colder surface, but the outcome in terms of surface cooling and agricultural disruption is comparable to, and in some scenarios more severe than, the worst historical volcanic winters. The study of 536 is, in this sense, directly relevant to the most serious existential risks that human civilization currently faces. The third major eruption of the 536 to 547 sequence, occurring around 547 CE and tentatively identified from ice core evidence, brought the period of most intense volcanic forcing to an end, but the climatic anomaly persisted for decades thereafter as the oceans slowly absorbed the excess heat that had been blocked during the volcanic winter. The recovery from the late antique Little Ice Age was gradual and uneven. In some regions, the climate began to improve noticeably by the late 6th century, and the agricultural recovery is reflected in tree ring records that show steadily widening growth rings after the narrow series of the 536 to 547 period. In others, the recovery was slower, interrupted by secondary climate anomalies and by the continued devastation of recurring plague outbreaks that prevented populations from rebuilding the agricultural infrastructure that had been neglected or abandoned during the worst years. The full recovery to pre-536 conditions, in terms of both temperature and the demographic and agricultural systems that those temperatures supported, took approximately a century, and it was never complete in some of the most severely affected regions. The plague of Justinian recurred in multiple waves through the late 6th and early 7th centuries, each wave finding a population that had not fully recovered from the previous one and that had no effective means of preventing or treating the disease. The genetic evidence from ancient Yersinia pestis genomes suggests that the pathogen underwent evolutionary changes between the first wave of 541 to 549 and the subsequent waves, with some of those changes potentially affecting its virulence and transmissibility. Whether those evolutionary changes made the later waves more or less severe than the first is a question that the paleogenetic evidence alone cannot answer, but the historical sources suggest that the later waves, while still devastating, were not as catastrophic as the initial outbreak, possibly because the population had been so reduced by the first wave that the density of susceptible individuals was lower, reducing the reproduction number of the pathogen. The gradual recovery of the climate and the eventual subsidence of the plague after the early 7th century created conditions for a demographic and agricultural recovery that would, over the following centuries, produce the medieval populations of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. But the world that recovered was profoundly different from the world that had existed before 536. The great cities of late antiquity, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, Rome itself, had been reduced to fractions of their former populations. The trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean world were disrupted and would never fully recover their pre-plague extent. The intellectual traditions of the classical world, the philosophical schools, the legal academies, the medical traditions, had lost the population of educated practitioners necessary to sustain them. The 6th century was not, as was once thought, the end of classical civilization, but it was a profound and irreversible transformation of it. The city of Rome provides one of the most vivid illustrations of the transformation. At the height of the empire, Rome had been the largest city in the Western world, with a population variously estimated at between 500,000 and 1 million people, a metropolis sustained by the grain imports of North Africa and Egypt, the slave labor of the empire's conquered territories, and the administrative and commercial activity of the imperial court. By the late 6th century, the city's population had fallen to perhaps 30 to 50,000, a reduction of 90% or more from its imperial peak. The great forums and temples were falling into disrepair, their marble being quarried for new construction or burned for lime. The aqueducts that had supplied the city's baths and fountains were cut or broken. The Colosseum still stood, but the gladiatorial games that had once filled it had ended. The circus races that had been the great popular entertainment of the imperial city continued sporadically, but the resources and the population to sustain them at their former scale were gone. Into the ruins of late antique Rome, the medieval papacy gradually assumed the administrative and welfare functions that the imperial government had abandoned. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, became responsible for feeding the poor of the city, maintaining its infrastructure, managing its relations with the Germanic kingdoms that now controlled Italy, and preserving the literary and administrative culture of the Roman tradition in monastic libraries and church schools. The Catholic Church that emerged from the 6th century was a very different institution from the Church of the early 4th century, when Constantine had made Christianity the official religion of the empire. It was an institution that had been tested by catastrophe, that had survived when the state around it had partly collapsed, and that had assumed institutional roles that its theology had not originally intended. The medieval papacy, with its political power, its cultural authority, its vast institutional apparatus, was partly the creation of the crisis that began in 536. The 536 event and its aftermath raise a question that goes beyond the historical and the scientific, a question about the relationship between human civilization and the natural systems on which it depends, and about the degree to which complex societies can be rendered fragile by their own complexity. Late antique civilization at its height was impressively sophisticated. The Roman legal tradition had created systems of property rights and contract law that facilitated commerce across enormous distances. The military organization of the late Roman and early Byzantine Empire was capable of projecting power over thousands of kilometers. The literary and philosophical traditions of the classical world were preserved in libraries across the empire and were actively studied and taught. The engineering achievements of the period, the aqueducts, The roads, the great churches and palaces, were products of an institutional capacity for organized, large-scale production that had no parallel in the ancient world. And yet all of that sophistication was underlain by the same agricultural foundation that had underlain every complex society since the Neolithic: the annual cycle of planting and harvest, the dependence on favorable growing conditions, the thin margin between adequacy and shortage that determined whether the cities could be fed. When the climate disrupted that foundation, not for 1 year, but for a decade, the sophistication of the institutional superstructure proved insufficient to compensate for the collapse of the base. The laws, the armies, the libraries, the aqueducts, all of these things required people to operate them, and people required food, and the food was failing. The complexity that had made late antique civilization so impressive became, in the crisis, a liability. There were more things to maintain, more things to fail, more dependencies that could cascade into further failures when any single one of them was disrupted. The concept of systemic fragility, the idea that complex, highly interconnected systems can be more vulnerable to certain kinds of shocks than simpler systems, because their complexity creates dependencies that amplify rather than dampen the effects of disruption, is one that the 536 event illustrates with great clarity. The late antique economy's integration was an enormous source of efficiency and productivity in normal times. The same integration meant that a disruption affecting any major component of the system, a volcanic winter that reduced agricultural output across multiple regions simultaneously, would propagate through the entire system rather than being contained in the region of origin. The grain that was not produced in Egypt could not feed Constantinople. The tax revenues that were not collected in a depopulated province could not fund the army. The army that could not be funded could not defend the frontier. The frontier that was not defended was crossed by enemies. Each failure cascaded into the next. Historians and complexity theorists have pointed to this pattern as a general feature of the relationship between complex systems and extreme events, a feature that is as relevant to modern civilization as it was to late antiquity. The global supply chains, financial systems, and energy grids of the 21st century are far more complex and more tightly integrated than anything that existed in the 6th century, and they provide enormous benefits in normal conditions. They also create systemic dependencies, connections between distant parts of the global economy whose disruption can propagate in ways that are difficult to predict and may be difficult to control. The lesson of 536 is not that complexity is bad, or that integration should be avoided. It is that complexity creates vulnerabilities as well as capabilities, and that preparing for extreme events requires understanding those vulnerabilities and building in the redundancies and buffers that can prevent local disruptions from becoming global catastrophes. The parallel with modern civilization is one that complexity theorists have explicitly drawn. Modern societies are in many respects more robust than their ancient predecessors. They have access to more diverse energy sources, more productive agricultural technologies, more sophisticated medical knowledge, and more effective institutions for distributing resources and managing crises. But they are also far more complex, far more specialized, and far more interdependent than any previous civilization in history. The concentration of food production in a small number of highly productive regions, the dependence of those regions on fossil fuel inputs, the integration of the global financial system, the concentration of critical infrastructure in a small number of highly vulnerable nodes. All of these features of modern civilization create potential cascading failure modes that the historical record does not provide clear precedents for. The 536 event is, in this context, not merely a historical curiosity. It is a case study in how natural forcing can interact with social and institutional vulnerability to produce outcomes that exceed anything that any individual component of the system could have predicted. The legacy of 536 can be traced in the cultural and intellectual history of the following centuries, in the ways that the experience of extreme catastrophe shaped the worldviews of the civilizations that survived it and the civilizations that rose in its wake. The medieval European worldview, with its emphasis on the transience of earthly prosperity, the omnipresence of death and suffering, the necessity of divine grace, and the expectation of eschatological catastrophe, was not simply a philosophical construction. It was, in significant part, a psychological and cultural response to a historical experience in which earthly prosperity had indeed proved transient, in which death and suffering had been omnipresent, and in which the world had seemed, for a generation, to be ending. The theology of the medieval church, with its insistence that this world was a vale of tears and that salvation was to be sought in the next, made more sense in a world that had actually experienced something approaching the end of the world than in the relatively stable world of the High Roman Empire. The Islamic tradition, which emerged in Arabia in the early 7th century, also bears the marks of the 6th century catastrophe. Not in the specific content of Islamic theology, which has its own intellectual and spiritual sources, but in the context of its emergence. Islam arose in a world that had been profoundly destabilized by a century of climatic crisis and plague, in which the established powers were exhausted and their populations decimated, in which the trade networks that had sustained the late antique economy were disrupted, and in which the old certainties, about who governed, who was powerful, what the future would look like, had been shattered. The religious and political movement that Muhammad founded emerged into a vacuum that the disasters of the 6th century had created, and it spread with a speed that is only fully comprehensible in the context of a world that had been made desperate for new answers by a century of catastrophe. The Chinese history of the 6th and 7th centuries tells a parallel story. The political fragmentation that followed the collapse of the Northern Wei dynasty in the mid-6th century, itself partly a consequence of the climatic and agricultural crisis of the 536 period, eventually produced the Sui dynasty, which reunified China by force in the 580s and 590s at enormous cost, and then the Tang dynasty, which built on the Sui's achievements and produced one of the greatest periods of Chinese civilization. The Tang dynasty's achievements, in art, literature, technology, and political organization, were built on the ruins of the catastrophe that the 536 event had helped initiate, and they incorporated the lessons that catastrophe had taught about the fragility of centralized states and the importance of flexible, adaptive governance. The Tang period's relative openness to foreign religions, cultures, and technologies, its cosmopolitan character, reflected a world that had been made aware of its own vulnerability by the experience of crisis. The experience of the 536 catastrophe and its aftermath also contributed to developments in agricultural technology that would eventually increase the resilience of farming systems against future climatic shocks. The collapse of agricultural production in the 6th century created incentives for the development and adoption of more cold-tolerant crop varieties, more diverse agricultural systems less dependent on any single crop, and better techniques for storing surplus production against the possibility of future shortfalls. The heavy moldboard plow, which allowed the cultivation of heavier, wetter soils in northern Europe and increased the agricultural productivity of the region, was adopted and spread more widely in the period following the 6th century crisis, contributing to the gradual recovery of northern European agricultural output in the 7th and 8th centuries. The horse collar, which allowed horses to pull heavy loads more efficiently than the ox harnesses that had been standard in the Roman period, improved agricultural productivity and allowed the expansion of cultivation into areas that had previously been too difficult to farm. These technologies were not invented in response to the 536 catastrophe. They had been developing gradually in the preceding centuries, but their adoption and spread were accelerated by the crisis, which created both the necessity and the economic incentive for improvements in agricultural efficiency. The monasteries that survived the 6th century crisis also contributed to agricultural recovery in ways that are often underappreciated. Monastic communities maintained agricultural knowledge and practice through periods when the surrounding secular society was too disrupted to sustain continuous cultivation. They preserved the seeds of crop varieties that might otherwise have been lost in the chaos of famine and population displacement. They maintained the records, the accounts, the agricultural manuals, the observations of weather and harvest, that allowed the gradual accumulation of knowledge about which practices worked in the changed climate conditions. The monastic agricultural tradition of the early medieval period was, in part, a product of the catastrophe that began in 536, an institutional response to the need to maintain agricultural knowledge and practice through periods of extreme disruption. The year 536 ended. As all years do, even the worst of them. The sun eventually shone with full brightness again. The harvests eventually recovered, in those places where there was anyone left to plant them. The plague eventually subsided, between one wave and the next, long enough for the survivors to bury their dead, tend their fields, and try to rebuild something of what had been lost. But the world that emerged from the darkness was not the same world that had entered it. The populations were smaller. The cities were fewer and less grand. The trade networks were narrower. The intellectual traditions were thinner. The political structures were simpler, more local, more dependent on the power of strongmen and warlords and warrior aristocracies than on the sophisticated administrative machinery of the late Roman state. The long 6th century, the period from approximately 536 to 640, during which the climatic crisis, the plague, and their political consequences played out, was the crucible in which the medieval world was forged. The world that the medieval period eventually produced, with its distinctive culture, its religious institutions, its feudal political structures, its remarkable intellectual achievements, was a response to the catastrophe that 536 had initiated. The people who lived through 536 did not know they were living through a turning point in history. They knew they were cold and hungry and frightened. They knew the sun was wrong and the harvests were failing and the bodies were accumulating faster than they could be buried. They knew that the world had changed in ways they could not explain, and they knew that the change might be permanent. Some of them, the ones who survived, who managed to find food in the years of famine and to avoid the plague in the years of pestilence, who adapted to the changed conditions with sufficient flexibility and resilience, those people were the ancestors of everyone who came after. They did not feel like the survivors of history. They felt like people who had gotten through another terrible year and who were trying to prepare for the next one. That feeling, of trying to get through the terrible year while not knowing whether the next one will be better, is one that is not entirely alien to the present. The 21st century has experienced its own sequence of compounding disasters: a global pandemic, extreme climate events, the disruption of supply chains and food systems, the strain on institutions that were designed for a different world. The scale is different, the mechanisms are different, the knowledge and the resources available to respond are immeasurably greater. But the underlying dynamic, of multiple stressors converging on a system that was not designed to absorb them simultaneously, producing outcomes that none of the individual components could have predicted, is recognizably the same dynamic that the 6th century experienced. The darkness of 536 was not the last darkness. It was the first of many. And the question that it raises, how much can a civilization absorb before it becomes something different from what it was, is a question that every generation must answer for itself, in the circumstances of its own particular darkness. The people of 536 did not know that the darkness would end. They did not know that the sun would eventually shine fully again, that the harvests would recover, that the plague would eventually subside, that the world they had known, or something that resembled it, transformed but recognizable, would persist and eventually flourish. They had no guarantee of any of those things. What they had was the necessity of continuing, of planting the fields even when the harvest was uncertain, of building the walls even when the barbarians were at the gates, of preserving the books even when the civilization that had produced them was contracting. The resilience of the 6th century was not the resilience of optimism or confidence. It was the resilience of necessity, the resilience of people who had no choice but to go on, and who went on, and whose going on made possible everything that came after. That resilience is the other legacy of 536, the legacy that the historical catastrophe literature sometimes obscures by focusing too exclusively on the destruction. The destruction was real and enormous, but the reconstruction was also real. The monasteries that preserved the texts, the farmers who found the cold hardy varieties and the draining techniques that eventually made the northern European soils productive again, the administrators who maintained the records and the laws through the worst years, the religious traditions that provided the framework of meaning that allowed people to face catastrophe without despair, the anonymous millions who simply survived and fed their children and passed on to those children enough of what they knew and valued that something continuous can be traced between the world of 536 and the world that eventually emerged from the darkness. The sun went dark for 18 months. The world did not end. It changed, profoundly, painfully, irreversibly. And in that changed world, people found ways to live and eventually to build again. If this documentary kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are more moments when the world went dark and then, eventually, found its way back to light. More catastrophes that remade everything they touched, and more stories of the people who lived through them and built something new on the other side. A new documentary every week, always in the hours designed for rest, always going further than you expect.